What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Nuclear Barbarians. It is I, your nuclear barbarian, Emmett Penny, and I am here with Decouple Studios' one and only Jesse Freeston. How's it going, buddy?
It is top shelf. It is right where mama hides the cookies.
There we
It's
go.
our
Love it.
first sunny day in weeks here in Montreal, and yeah, I'm loving it.
Oh, that's great. I've always wanted to go Montreal. I've always wanted to ride on trains in Montreal, which I hear is
Mm,
like a top tier experience.
you mean the subway?
No, no, no. Like I was watching like an Anthony Bourdain thing where he goes to
Oh,
Montreal,
okay.
and there were a bunch of people being like, "Dude, like the trains in this whole province, like everything around here, gotta
Yeah,
do it. It's part of who we are."
interesting.
And I was
Interesting. I
like,
wouldn't have put it in my
"Wow."
top 10, but sure. Yeah, let's give it a try.
Um,
Uh, but yeah, we do have one of the world's only silent subways, or like mostly silent because it runs on rubber tires.
get
Well,
out. That's
it's not
wild.
silent, but it just sounds a lot less cinematic than the New York subway, for example.
Damn. Or the Chicago L,
You
which
just
is
hear
like,
the engine. Yeah.
yeah, which is like screaming past me. I can hear it out the window right now. Um,
Right. Oh, right, like Blues Brothers style.
yeah, yeah,
It
yeah.
goes by so often you won't even notice it.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
So I wanted to bring you on here. I've wanted you on here for a while actually, because I love your videos. I
Mm.
love your radiation video. I love the one you just did on waste, and we'll get to that. But the thing that I haven't been able to piece together is where the hell you came from. You are a fellow brother to Chris Kiefer of the Great White North,
That's right.
and you're on the decouple team.
Uh-huh.
How did that happen?
So yeah, I mean, we say north, but I think I'm actually probably south of you in latitude here in Montreal. Just
Oh, probably.
for whatever it's worth, sometimes we can get a little bit, our imagination can go a little wild with how far Canada is. I love, like, I lived in DC for like almost 3 years, and it was just hilarious sometimes just hearing people like react to me being from Canada, and it's just like, wow.
Hmm.
But anyway, sorry. Yeah. Where do I come from?
Yeah, and how
Uh,
did you end up on on the decouple team?
oh yeah. Okay. So Chris and I go way back, like
Mm,
11 years we've known each other, probably, back when both of us were definitely politically active in a very different way than
mm,
we are today, both in terms of like how we spent our time and what we were fighting for, I would say. But I think there's a dream that links it all together. There's a vision of the future that links it all together, and it's just the facts changed.
hmm.
And But I would say, so me personally, my family's originally from Northern Ontario. I was born in Northern Ontario, like mining and logging country.
Hmm.
I'm like the only one in my family that grew up in the city. When I was 5, my mom and I moved to the capital, to Ottawa.
Mm,
And I would say my political vision as I came up was really basically, I arrived at it by secretly downloading and printing out the lyrics to Rage Against the Machine songs at
there we go.
school because I didn't
What's
have the
up,
internet at
brother?
home, and yeah, that's it. And then just going home, listening to them over, and listening to the songs over and over again, reading the lyrics, and then going back to school and trying to figure out who Mami Abu Jamal was, or who the Zapatistas were, or whatever
Hmm.
it was. But I think the aesthetic of the revolution probably came first.
Mm,
I was a class clown in school, so I was constantly in trouble. There's multiple classes where I had accumulated detentions, and sometimes I would hit a moment where there wasn't enough days left in the school year for me to do all my detentions that I'd accumulated. So then it was just like borrowed time. I could just do
yeah,
whatever.
yeah,
Anyways, just
yeah.
give you a sense. Like, I didn't do well with authority. And I came up about 5 years before Ritalin was massively distributed. So I uh, I had teachers had to put up with me and had to use discipline instead of drugs to deal with me.
Hmm.
And so yeah, so I think I gravitated towards that. Also, I grew up working a lot of like shitty fast food jobs. I worked for a lot of shitty
Hmm.
corporations. I worked at Taco Bell. I worked at our major grocery store chain, Loblaws, owned by the second richest family in Canada, the Westons. I worked a lot tree planting, a lot of like manual jobs
Hmm.
where you're called a team member, but you're
Yeah,
not. You're
there
not
we
really
go.
on the team.
Yeah.
And so yeah, all this created a bit of anti-systemic rage in me, and then it took its political expression. Invasion of Iraq, anti-globalization movement, and
Hmm.
the kind of like wanting to be a part of something that was calling out the damage greed was doing
Mm,
to
mm,
us, to our planet, and different things like this. And then in Canada, it often takes this other dimension to it, which is doing solidarity with Indigenous nations.
Yeah,
So
for sure. A
I
huge
became
thing
very
over
involved.
up there. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the US could probably use a bit more of it, to be
Yeah.
honest.
Yeah. I
Uh,
think the problem is that it's confined to different, mostly to different states. And
mhm.
that's how it does it. Like the proportions are way different, which is
Right, like
part of why
Oklahoma is going to be a lot more
New
open. Like,
Mexico is going to be way
uh,
more involved with it. Like they have the highest percentage of indigenous people in state compared to anyone else, you know.
right.
So I think that that's a huge part of it. But yeah, no doubt,
Mhm.
huge issue. And so that's part of your vision, the what you came up in as well in
Right, and
Canada.
it comes with a worldview, in
Hmm.
some ways, right? Which is comes from, you know, like I'm Christian adjacent. I spent a few years going to church as a kid, but that stuff gets passed down to you.
Hmm.
And you know, the idea of like we have sinned, you know, like I think was like deeply part of my worldview without me
Hmm.
realizing it. You know, it's like the fish doesn't know what
Sure.
water is, and I think the water
Yeah.
was a world of evil and of good and evil, and that 500 years ago we started off on this very evil track in the
Mm,
Americas. And I still believe that to a large degree, but it came with it a rejection of a lot of great things that made life easier for people that came out of that same time frame and geography, basically.
mm.
And I did some throwing out of the baby with the bathwater for a while, and now I'm in the process of trying to grab the baby before it hits the sidewalk.
Yeah, so
And
talk to me about that. So like when I hear that, like what I'm guessing is that um you know, like I came up in the left as well. That's the vibe I'm getting.
mhm,
Um and there's sort of like a rosary of commitments that you rehearse. And for
yes.
a long time, and this seems to be changing now, which I think is great. Because I think this is really only works if it's like sort of bipartisan and everybody gets
Mhm,
on board, is that there was an association of energy, particularly nuclear and other projects, as being manifestations of uh, all of these injustices and engines of those injustices.
mhm,
And so, in calling out all of these negative things that we see, we end up morally condemning what end up being industrial systems that everyone needs.
mhm.
Is that sort of what I'm picking up from you?
Absolutely, yeah. I think people are right to say we don't need it in the sense that our species survived, you know, thousands and thousands and thousands of years without it. But I
Mm,
think people are often tricking themselves. I know I was, in thinking that I don't want it, right?
mhm,
Like in thinking that I would prefer a simpler life. And it took me living a few things to really make me realize that in my own flesh, you know. Yeah, like for example, like if I mean I could keep going on with the story actually that kind of
no,
gets
no,
to this point.
I actually, yeah, I would love to hear like what these events were or whatever that
Yeah,
sort of
yeah,
changed your
like
perspective. I love that.
so you know, I ended up making videos originally in Central America. I lived for
Mhm,
a few years in Honduras and El Salvador, originally following the ideas of Paulo Freire.
mhm.
Again, with I don't know if that name means much to
Oh,
you, but
oh, yeah, 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 yeah.
I'm sure a lot of
I
the audience doesn't.
Yeah, yeah. Like so, Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed,
Mhm,
in very seminal Latin American left-wing text. And also in El Salvador, you have the legacies of Bishop Oscar Romero,
mhm,
and who was against sort of this right-wing government taking over there that was basically brutalizing the population. He was martyred for it. He's since
yeah,
been canonized. Having grown up, he was also a Jesuit, so having grown up in the Jesuit system, we did a
that's
whole
right. I
unit
for,
on liberation theology, which is sort of the left wing Catholicism that comes out of the Latin American experience and the Vatican II,
mhm.
meeting about bringing the kingdom of God to here on earth.
Well, letting
Uh,
people read the Bible for themselves and
yeah,
talk
yeah,
about it
exactly.
without the guy saying it in Latin and then at the very end throwing in a little Spanish of like, oh yeah, by the way, just go keep making babies and scoring points for the afterlife.
Yeah.
and yeah, anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no. So you're in the mix there while you're doing that, your whole thing. I was just saying
So
that to sort of put a little meat on the bones for people that
yeah,
didn't come up in that experience in the same way that we did.
totally, yeah. So for me, it was actually a very, very rebellious anarchist physics professor at the University of Ottawa. I wasn't
Mm,
in school at the time. I was working at the Marriott, doing they call it being a porter. It basically
mhm.
when there's big banquets in the capital in Ottawa and like 300 people come and you have to make sure everybody gets a plate of chicken that they don't eat, and like and like
Yeah.
make sure all the tables are right and everybody's got a pen and a paper that they don't use, and you got to do all that stuff. Anyways, it was in that moment that, and I had just come out of university and I really didn't like my university experience. I really didn't like the experience of being in school. I like knew myself to be an extremely curious kid,
Hmm.
from the cradle, but like hated school. And I just knew there was a problem with that. And there was this professor who was like at war with the University of Ottawa for numerous reasons, but one of the fronts that he had taken up was that he refused to grade his students.
Mm,
And then he became kind of a figure and started just kind of like being an ally of all the different social movements in Ottawa. And he would hand out these like 10 pedagogy of the oppressed books a day.
mm.
um and so all of us ended up trying to read it. It's a very dense book.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
don't know how many people make it to the end, but you get the gist of it pretty early on, which is just like it's a horizontal worldview.
Hmm.
It's taking the hierarchy, taking the power out of the classroom. And I think it works in small groups of extroverts, like to be
Mm,
learning through dialogue, where everybody's kind of trying out the ideas, and then the professor's going, "Oh yeah, that's really interesting. However, this is not quite true. Blah 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 blah." And then let's go again. And I think extroverts thrive in it, and introverts end up not getting much out of it, just hearing a bunch of
mm.
non-experts blab at them. But like, but it was Freire's ideas, that in the Jesuits took up after Vatican II actually, and had these comunidades de base, they called them, and they would have the farmers together in small groups. Usually it wasn't even the priest. It was like a young university student or whatever that was working with the priest, who would sit there and like help them learn to read through the Bible and
Hmm.
learn Jesus for themselves. And they figured out Jesus is a pretty badass kind of collectivist,
Sure. Yeah.
and not really the guy that they were being told,
Mm,
through the priest,
mm.
who themselves were living in fear of these right-wing regimes. Anyways,
Yes.
so it's a crazy long history. But so I was down there, and then I started working for Telesur. I got good enough at Spanish that I was an on-camera correspondent for Telesur,
That's
which was
amazing.
like the public broadcaster of Latin America. It's since lost a lot of its funding, and isn't what it used to be. But in its heyday, it was like one of the most watched television channels in Latin America. And there I was, and on camera and reporting from Honduras, and then doing documentaries from there. And then eventually I came back to Canada and ended up working a lot with Naomi Klein and Avi
Hmm.
Lewis, as well as a name that's very big here in Canada, David Suzuki, but probably not as big in the US. But he's like our Carl Sagan, if Carl Sagan
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
like, he's
Okay.
the popularizer of science for Canada, like the number
Hmm.
one science show in Canada for 40 years. He's the host. And he he has foundations all dedicated to 100% renewable energy dream.
Ah,
And so, like I did the video to launch his climate emergency unit just 2 years ago. So I was like deeply, deeply embedded in that, and to a certain degree eating from that movement.
sure.
And
Yeah.
but at some
So what
point,
happened? So what happened? Yeah.
so
Tell me
what
what
happened? So
happened.
here's the story. If you wanted the moment where I felt it, I was there's a nation here called the Wet'suwet'en Nation,
Hmm.
and they are very small in terms of indigenous nation. They only have about 3,500 members, but they occupy their traditional territory is in the most reasonable place to build a pipeline through the Rocky Mountains. So
Hmm.
they have a valley called the Bulkley Valley. It's in northern British Columbia. And yeah, so basically, according to Canadian law, according to a Supreme Court decision called the Delgamuukw court case, which is in 1990, which was fought by the Wet'suwet'en and their neighbors, the Gitxsan, the Canadian government, if it wants to build a major project on the traditional territory of a nation whose traditional government is still intact, despite hundreds of years of Canadian policy of trying to destroy those traditional governments. If that traditional government managed to survive, then the Canadian government has to deal with them if they want for that to go through. The Wet'suwet'en are one of the nations who still have their feast hall where they make decisions. And they've repeatedly said no to pipelines. They've never once said yes to any of these pipeline projects. And after the third pipeline project, the government just said, you know what, we're sending in the RCMP, the Canadian FBI. We're just going to crack heads and push this thing through. And so I was out there working on their media team and filming for a film that's going to be on our national broadcaster later this year, which I'm not the director of, just a cinematographer. But while we're out there, our relationship with the nation was we would film and edit as we went. Often one of the shameful acts of a documentary filmmaker is to film an event of a social movement or whatever it might be that's really important, that's really significant, but then not release the footage until the film comes out 2.5 years later. And then everybody hates you because you were this greedy motherfucker who just, like held this footage. So it was a great opportunity for us to get out of that mold, which I had never really been in, but as I came out of video journalism, I am about kind of getting things out. And then if it's useful for a film 2 years later, who cares? Like, use it again. And so the model worked well for me, but it's quite innovative. It's quite new in the documentary film world to be working like that with a nation, as what we call settlers here in Canada, as people who are not Indigenous. And so, but it was in that process of just spending months and months, 60 kilometers or 42 miles, or whatever the hell it is, down a logging road with no cell phone service and in the winter. And I got giardia, or beaver fever, which for those who aren't familiar is a parasite. It's kind of a nasty little feature of a healthy ecosystem, which is that it comes from the poop of animals. That's what we call it, beaver fever here. And so it's like part of the movement is to save this river where the salmon spawn, and which they have great fear that digging under it to put the pipeline through will eventually leak, as we've seen many pipeline leaks, and will destroy this river, which is key to their traditional economy and lifestyle and spirituality that goes back thousands and thousands of years. And so so anyways, that same river gave me giardia because it's so healthy. But then it was many days until I could get a ride back into town. And so I was just diarrhea, no energy, and just kind of like wasting away in the woods. And I finally got a ride into town, and the doctor took one look at my stool sample and said, "Where are you getting your water?" And I was like, "From the river." She's like, "Are you at the camps?" I'm like, "Yeah." She's like, "You have giardia." And I was like, "I knew it." And she gave me antibiotics, and within 24 hours, I was back to normal. But I'd lost 18 pounds. I think it was 17 or 18 pounds. I don't know if you can tell from the framing, but like I can't lose much more than that.
Yeah, you don't have a lot to lose, bud.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I really felt like I lost a lot of strength, and I lost all this stuff, and I don't know, Chris at Decouple is a doctor, and I talked to him, and I was like, "Would I have died if I didn't get antibiotics?" And he was like, "Probably not." I'm like, "The internet says I might have," and he's like, "Yeah, you probably would have been fine." But it still gave me that feeling of like, nature can kill you, and there's these antibiotics that were sitting in this clinic, and somebody had to have or a lot of people had to have enough free time and resources to discover those antibiotics, and then to mass produce them, and then to make sure they're spread out all over the world, so that people don't die, or at least get severely hindered by things like this. That it made me, so basically I'd lost all this weight, but I'd gained a lot of perspective.
So basically it sounds like you in that experience developed quite quickly a respect for the built world that you hadn't actually had before. Right? Am I hearing that right?
That's exactly right. I hadn't put it in the terms of the built world, but definitely yeah, it's like civilization,
Yeah.
like being able to have specifications, and but
Hmm.
like I'm like very open into what that civilization can look like, and I
Sure.
don't think we're living in the best of all. I'm not a
Best of all
technological
possible
determinist.
worlds.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm not a technological determinist or whatever. I don't think, I think our ideas are important, and we can use these technologies and like mix them with our ideas and make something a lot better. And so that's,
Hmm.
anyways, that might get us into something else.
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
yeah, that was a big thing. And then in French we call it a moment déclencheur. It's like the before and after moment. And I think yeah, and then Chris was just waiting for me, basically.
So
Uh
once you had that revelation, once you
yeah.
had that moment of clarity, you were ready to hear the nuclear message from Chris, basically.
Well, yeah, there's another aspect to it, which is that I was often trying to charge my batteries with solar panels in the winter in Canada.
Oh yeah, and that
Um,
didn't go well.
no, not very well at all. So, so like, yeah, realizing that like I'm here as part of a movement to fight against a pipeline to bring fossil fuels primarily to Asia,
Hmm.
and here I am firing up a generator to charge a battery like this big,
Yeah,
after like 8 hours of the solar panel trying its best and failing miserably.
yeah,
And then just to kind of like in my head do, okay, this is just a battery for a camera. And then,
right.
and then just without the math, just sort of just yeah, just using my imagination to imagine powering the basics of a
Hmm.
dignified life for billions of people on the planet, and then
Hmm.
just like, oh my god, it's not gonna work, like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and then Chris was waiting for me and was like, all the Naomi Klein books that you read that got you into this in the first place, go look at the footnotes. They're all going to be this one guy, Mark C. Jacobson. Here's the critique of what he puts out, and go through that. And then a
Mm.
big moment was he showed me the electricity map, and he was like, what's the model for your 100% renewable thing? I'm like, I guess Germany. We don't talk about it much, but I guess it's Germany. And then he pulled it up and was like, you see the like orange country here? Yeah,
Yeah,
that's Germany, and the sun's shining right now. And right next to it, here's France, and it's green. And oh yeah, and here's
yeah.
Ontario, and we're green. Remember smog days when you were growing up? Yeah, I hate smog days. Yeah, we used to not be able to go outside and play. And he's like, yeah, we don't have those anymore. Did you notice? I'm like, oh my god, you're right, we don't have those anymore. Yeah, it's because we switched from coal to nuclear. Oh shit, why didn't nobody tell me about this? It was so, but I mean, I'm condensing it. I was very resistant at first. It took him like a few months to really get me into it. But it's helpful to have a persuasive friend around, and when they're 6'9", the persuasion just gets magnified. So
Yeah, right. Yeah.
yeah.
No, I think that's sort of that's a very I love that story. It's very beautiful. And like now you create these very informative like mini docs
Mm,
for Decouple Studios on YouTube. And I like that you're sort of taking on the like big button items for
mm,
people that are likely as resistant as you were,
yeah,
right? Like I really see that in the content you put out. So I believe you have one on radiation, right?
yeah,
And where you talk about the transition into smog days, and out of that, like through the in Ontario from coal to nuclear, which is great. By the way, everybody, that'll be in the show notes. So you can check that out. And your most recent one is on waste. So let me ask you, like, I have a theory for why you picked these, and it's because they're big button items that I think, as I just said, for
yeah.
resistant people. Why did you decide to make one on radiation and then one on waste?
Waste waste for me was like I as I've been going along, I've been trying to maintain contact with the me of 2 years ago, right? Like,
Sure. Yeah,
um,
vital.
and and I've realized the degree to which, like, when you go all in on this stuff, especially if you're someone like me who doesn't have kids or anything, and does have time to put into it, you can very quickly, I call it the Chris effect. You can you can like very quickly get to a depth of information which renders it like, it's not Chris. Chris is actually pretty good at speaking to the public, which
Hmm.
is why he's done such a great job as the president of Canadians for Nuclear Energy and in advocating and stuff like this. But I think there was a value of staying even like trying to stay like what I'm trying to say is, when I'm around nuclear advocates and they start talking about like their favorite reactors and why, I like pretend I have to leave. I find it,
Mhm.
it's like in the sense of like
Oh
I'm
yeah, you have
trying.
left the public behind as
Yeah,
soon
yeah,
as
yeah,
that
like
conversation opens
exactly,
up. Yeah,
exactly, yeah. And
totally.
I feel like I feel this desire to go there, like you know what I mean, to like
Hmm.
to get to know the thing better and better and better. But then I'm like, no, 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 that's not where my strengths can serve people. Like I'm actually not a scientist or
Oh.
an engineer. You know what I mean? Like I'm a storyteller, and I want to stay at the level of the story. And like I feel like I've got enough of a grasp now of like why nuclear.
Hmm.
And while I keep learning more, I do want to maintain a little bit. I still want to maintain a connection with the me that didn't know anything. And like, and so I, in terms of picking the episodes, Waste from the beginning was the first one I wanted to do, but it just took so long to be able. I knew I needed to film next to it. I like in my head, I can't do this video without me standing next to it.
Yeah.
um because otherwise people are just gonna be like, yeah, whatever, like
Hmm.
there's so it's so thick, the wall that you have to
Yeah.
go through. And so I needed to get to the other side of the wall of the building that has the waste in it, like because here in Canada they're inside warehouses. I know in the US they're mostly outside, but these things
Hmm.
are really hard to get to, except in some places in Europe where like you just have to call them up and they tell you to come on in and
Yeah, right. They're like,
bring
yeah, sure, come
bring
by.
your camera.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, you just turn up. Yeah.
that's it.
And
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
But I actually didn't know that. So we'd been like banging our head trying to get into the ones here in Canada. And so that it finally happened. So it's at like episode 14. Okay, we're good. Let's go in there
Hmm.
and film. And it's really funny, I'm in there filming, and when you do these tours, you get like 7 very well paid executives kind of following you around, like
Sure.
like
Yeah. Yeah.
as
Yeah.
you're on this tour. And I was, I'd set up, like I had a rough idea what I wanted to say, and I was using the word waste, and they interrupt me and like, with all respect, we don't use that word. And it's like, I know, but I made a video, like I was hanging out with you guys too much, and I made a video about my tour of Bruce Power earlier, and I just kept saying used fuel, used fuel, used fuel, as I'm like
Yeah.
over
Nobody
on the
knows what that
catwalk
means.
over top of the fuel. And I actually showed this to some really smart friends of mine, some of which who even like work in renewable energy and stuff like this. And they watched the video and they're like, that's really great. It's still, for me, it's the waste. And I was like, no, I was standing on top of the waste. Like that
Yeah.
glowing blue stuff was the waste. And they go, oh, why didn't you say so?
Yeah.
And like,
Yeah.
and so
Totally.
I already made that mistake once. And so, and these guys were trying to correct me, like, please don't use the word. And I was like, no, you don't.
Yeah, you
you
have
know,
to meet people where they're at. I think that's
yeah,
something that the industry, that's one thing that I really appreciated about your waste video is that it felt like I wish it had been made when I first started getting into nuclear.
mm,
That's sort of the joy of being an advocate right now is that you're in early. So
yeah,
like you can make the content that would have helped you out way sooner,
exactly, yeah,
like you can do that favor to your past self.
right,
Um, and like to me, what I think is so important about that is that when the industry plays language games, like I get why there's a technical reason they say like spent fuel or used fuel or whatever they want to say
right.
for that. Like there's a
And
technical
it is
reason
more
for that.
accurate. It's
And it
just
is
technically more
scientifically more
accurate. Yeah.
accurate, yeah.
Uh-huh.
But when they commit to that for public comms rather than like
Mm-hmm.
internal
Yeah.
discussions or even with, those who know like experts or whatever, is they surrender the discursive ground to their opponents.
Yeah.
Like by making a technical correction, right? By being more right, they think they are being more successful.
Yeah.
And that is not true.
Yeah. That's
I think
exactly
that's
right.
why storytelling is so needed.
That's exactly right. And it's like, but I am better positioned to do that,
Yes.
than the industry. And that's why I, been so like stringent on not accepting any industry money,
Yeah.
for this project. And I know there's other projects out there that don't have that line, but like I still do see myself as a journalist and a filmmaker and a documentary filmmaker.
Sure.
And I need to have that integrity for myself. And also because there's definitely going to be a me that's doing stuff that's not nuclear in the future.
Yeah,
And
no, yeah, it can't be your
yeah,
whole life. Yeah, it won't
exactly.
pay all the bills. That
Right.
is for
Unless
damn
I
sure.
go into it. But like, as we said earlier, I'm not an engineer or a scientist. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's not my
Well, that's not your
specialty.
whole shtick. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, I think that that's important, right? So let me ask you this, right? So
Mm.
I'm sure, as I have, you have held on to friends from your life from a mere 2 years ago
Almost all of
who,
them.
yeah, who have all
Yeah.
of the commitments that you used to have in this domain.
Hmm.
How has this changed your relationship with them and their relationship with you, if at all?
I would say no, no. I mean, sometimes I get reports like that I became a topic of conversation at a dinner table or something
Sure,
like this.
sure,
Right?
sure.
And I like, my spirituality is primarily comes from stand-up comedy. And
Sure.
so I try to turn every conflict, every taboo, everything into
Hmm.
humor. And so that's how I've treated this subject. Like, with my friends, is I've just come into it laughing and left laughing. Like, like, isn't this crazy? Look where I am.
Yeah, love that.
Up the
That's great. Great
pandemic,
technique.
the pandemic locked me up at home with a bunch of IPCC reports and books and stuff like this. And now I'm pro nuclear, who thunk it?
Yeah.
And yeah, I try to just walk lightly like that with it. And it seems to be working out. And
Yeah, has
I
that been
do,
persuasive for them?
I think so. I mean, I don't have the other version of the multiverse to compare it to where I go in
Mm,
more heavy-handed, to
sure.
see how that would work out. But I would say it has been. I've definitely, there's even some people who I'm waiting for their public face to align with their private face.
Convictions, yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
which could be big turning points. Actually, I'm not going to name them because of the
Of
friendship that we
course.
have, but there are some people, I'm telling, there's some lurkers out there who are going to shock the world, at least around my world,
Yeah.
fairly soon when I eventually get them off the cliff. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's hugely important. So let me pivot a little. Before we were sort of we've talked about the importance of storytelling. We've talked about the vision of how things could be. What to you is the story of nuclear? Like, why should we have it? Beyond all the technical stuff that you and I know,
Mm-hmm.
right? What's powerful about it to you? What's that story?
Like what, like the most romantic story I could tell about nuclear?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Go for it. Go
Okay.
for it. And I want to
The
know and
roman
how it fits into your vision of the future.
Yeah. So climate change fits into a broader pollution thing, right?
Hmm.
So it's like burning stuff sends a bunch of things into the air
Hmm.
that we'd be better off if they weren't there.
Hmm.
And there's this magical other process that Arthur Eddington discovered the sun was being fed off of. Like, I love this moment where like Arthur Eddington starts showing up. Do you know who Arthur Eddington was?
No, I
He was
don't. Fill me in on
okay.
all this.
Okay, here we go. Arthur Eddington. I'm like this close to getting an Arthur Eddington tattoo. That could happen any day.
Woo!
This guy was a Quaker and the
Hmm.
leading astronomer in England around the time of the First World War. So as a Quaker, he's an internationalist and a pacifist.
Hmm.
So he is against the First World War, which at the time made him immediately an exile of the academic and elite
Yeah.
circles
Yeah, that's
that
box
he was a
office
part of.
poison at the time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And that was also happening to another internationalist pacifist in Germany, Albert Einstein,
Mm.
who was also against the war, who had actually always refused German citizenship because he was against nationalism. And I think as a Jew, felt something in the air,
Hmm.
and didn't want to be a part of anything nationalist.
Sure.
And so Eddington stumbles upon Einstein's ideas about gravity, and they start in totally illegal letter exchange in the middle of the
Mm.
war, where Einstein calls Eddington like the first person that ever understood my theory of general relativity,
Wow.
and it was all through like cursive and typewriter letters, to each other, illegal letters. And Eddington eventually comes out like in the middle of the war and says, guys, I think Isaac Newton, arguably the most famous Brit to ever have lived, and definitely the patron saint of the academic departments that he was in, I think he might have been wrong about gravity. And there's this official enemy of ours that I've been writing to illegally, and he's Jewish too. And anyways, like it's just like for the time, like their timing couldn't have been worse, or like maybe couldn't have been better in some weird ways to force them together. But Eddington managed to raise enough money to go to Sao Tome off the coast of Africa to get the picture of the 1919 solar eclipse that proved general relativity for the first time. He got Einstein to predict for him, because basically in order to see the gravity well of the sun, you need to block the sun and then see where if the position of the stars is where they should be given Einstein's gravity well, which would warp the sun's rays. Versus Newtonian gravity, which would shift the light a bit, but not to the same degree. And so Einstein told him exactly where each star was going to be at the moment of the solar eclipse. Eddington takes the photo, goes home, looks at it. Einstein's right, Newton's wrong. End of story.
Wow.
And then takes a while. He becomes like the popularizer in English of Einstein's ideas. And then a little while later, he uses E equals MC squared, which comes from special relativity, which had been known for a while, but he uses this to prove, Eddington again, to prove that the sun is not a combustion event. It is not burning. It is if it was burning, the sun could only last for, like, I think his numbers were like 19,000 years given its mass. Like that's the max for a combustion reaction of that mass. And so if Darwin's right about evolution, and if the earth has been here for millions of years or billions of years, then this is not burning. And in fact, I did the math, and it turns out E equals MC squared explains perfectly what's going on up there with the sun and why it could last for billions of years. And so, like, I just love this moment where Eddington shows up, and he actually at the World Power Conference in 1930 on stage tells the Rockefellers and the Morgans and all this stuff to, like, all you guys that are making the world's largest sums ever amassed, shipping all these fossil fuels around the world to be burned, like, start looking for a new job, because we figured out what the sun's doing, and it's just a matter of time before we bring it to Earth. And at the time, the idea was, it wasn't just like eat the rich or whatever. It was like coal and it's like actually choking our cities. Like, we know people are dying from this. Like 2 decades later, you'd have the London fog or whatever they called it. Like 3 days where London got choked because it had no wind, and a bunch of big weather event that made the coal soot just sit in the air. Anyways, like that was their motivation. And that's even without climate change. I mean, like there was some people that knew about climate change at that point, but they didn't. They weren't talking about it. So even without that, there was a motivation to be like, let's go to something way cooler and less destructive and less polluting than combustion. And now when you throw in climate change, it's just like game, set, match,
Yeah. So to you, part of the narrative for nuclear is that it's almost like a levering up of human potential and what we could get versus what we risk at staying in our current energy paradigm.
Yeah, I think it's at this point I'm actually more on the doomer side of things. Probably I'm more on like it's our only chance to avoid catastrophe. Given our numbers and given what people consider a dignified life and what I consider a dignified life, and like what people are actually going to do when energy becomes scarce, and what we're likely to model out from that. And even regardless if you're okay with the pollution and the climate effects of burning fossil fuels, like they are running out. I do believe that, and or they will run out at some point. And why run the experiment? Why not start the transition now?
Right. So it's getting ahead of it. And then sort of the other question I have is like, what's there's keeping the lights on, there's all of that, like, but when people want something, it's never just to satisfy a need,
Hmm.
right? There's always something else. Like, what to you is like the aesthetic dimension of the hope for nuclear, given all the doomerism that you uh, have in your worldview, right? Like to me, it's not just
Yeah.
like, well, if we just have these power plants, then it's like fine. There's always something else there. There's like a supplementary desire that's motivating. What's that for you?
To be honest, like my world, like nuclear is not the center of my politics or my
I,
worldview.
I assume it's
It
not. So
really,
that's sort of why I'm
yeah,
asking.
it really is a solution to a problem for me.
Hmm.
And it has this beautiful science history behind it, which makes me go,
Hmm.
ooh, wow, cool. And so yeah, like I really, I actually really don't think that humans do. Like I've just been reading Isaac Asimov's The Naked Sun,
Mm.
and it's from 19. It's weirdly um, future looking at like people who never see each other. It definitely feels like it's taking this planet Solaria. It's an Earth detective who goes to this planet Solaria where there's humans have been there for thousands of years,
Hmm.
and there's only 20,000 of them on an Earth-sized planet, and they all have these massive estates, and they only view each other. They never see each other, because
Hmm.
seeing is gross and like you shouldn't do that. And anyways, it's hell. Like when I look at it, it's like it's this weird hell where they're all living to be 350 years old, and they all have like hundreds of robots that do their bidding and limitless energy, and everything is technically wonderful, but in the process of solving all the problems and getting to like maximizing and optimizing through technology, they've arrived at a version of hell that I would
Hmm.
rather live 12 years on Earth. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, you know,
Yeah. Then put up
than
with that.
350 years like that, I think.
Hmm.
And so I do think, and I know it from my own life because my mom brought us up a social class in my lifetime. Like,
Hmm.
um, she, you know, got herself a really good job when I was young, and then like took her a while to like shift gears into actually spending the money she was making. But like,
Sure. Yeah.
but then, you know, by the time I'm like graduating high school, you know, we're going on ski trips and stuff. And
Hmm.
whereas like when I was young, we like really like I grew up eating like ramen noodles and craft dinner like a lot of the time. You know, it's like
Hmm.
it was a big shift. And at some point I had this conversation with her where she, you know, she was telling me stories about like, you know, oh fuck, I hope her friends aren't listening to this, but like some of her friends that she's met as she moved up this ladder, like just don't have the qualities that like her friends had when she was further down the ladder. Like,
Hmm.
and there's something about us being dependent on each other that creates community.
Hmm.
And I think we can see this in all the what you call it, data that we have on happiness
Hmm.
surveys, right? I think it's called like the turkey corner or some of that,
Oh, interesting.
your as your material well-being goes up or your GDP per capita or whatever
Hmm.
goes up, happiness goes up until you reach it, until it like plateaus at a certain point. And there's
Yeah, you
like
get
this,
diminishing returns. Yeah.
yeah, you really do get diminishing returns. And my experience might suggest that at some point you actually start to go down, like,
Mm.
um and so I think there's, and I don't know how to do this could get into a bigger thing actually about Darwin and stuff like that. I don't know how deep
Hmm.
you want to go into this.
But hey, look, we're just talking. I'm interested in this broader
Okay.
view of humanity, human happiness that you have, because
Yeah.
I think I'll just put my cards on the table. You know, I talk to people from across the political spectrum
Hmm.
here intentionally,
Yeah.
right? Like this is like a neutral zone
Right.
where I can talk to righties, I can talk to lefties, I can talk to centrists. It doesn't
Hmm.
matter because what's important to me is that I'm actually talking to Colin McClellan tomorrow from Digital Wildcatters. That episode will come out after this one. Um, and
Cool.
we're going to talk about telling better energy stories.
Okay.
And so, like, part of this is figuring out what we value and
Hmm.
how energy fits into that and what we see as important about being human.
Right.
Because the technical conversations are important, but mostly nuclear advocates listen to this show, and we all have those in our back pocket.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
What don't we have?
Right.
And
Okay.
it's these conversations.
All right. You ready for this one? So the project I
Yeah,
was
lay it on
working
me,
on,
brother.
okay, the project I had to abandon because somebody else made the film before I finished mine, and they did a very, very different job of it, but it was done in such a way that it made it so like there's no way I could get grants to finish mine now that this had been done. And it's basically around the scientist who did the experiment called Rat Park, and his name is Bruce Alexander, and this is considered one of the most controversial experiments ever in the history of studying addiction. And basically what Bruce found was that when he did the experiment, the idea was that you are either genetically predisposed or not to being an addict. And then if you get exposed to something that is addictive and you have those genes, you're fucked. And you're going to be an addict now. And Bruce, from his own experience, was like, I just working as a psychologist, working with addicts, was just like, that story doesn't check out with what I've experienced. And like all the people he knew that like recreationally used heroin and cocaine and all of these things that were considered the most addictive substances. And so he did an experiment called Rat Park, because one of the main experiments that was being used to prove this idea that these drugs hijack your brain was with rats. And we use rats for scientific experiments because they're social animals like us. They have a lot in common with us in terms of their organization. They're the most similar to us of animals that we don't care about torturing. So like you can get closer to us going into primates, but they have opposable thumbs sometimes. Like, it's like they start to look a little bit too much like us. Yeah. It gets, and we start to feel like we're doing harm, like we're doing like evil things. So we don't care about the rats. Give a rat's ass, even in our language. So they do it on rats. And so they show these rats where they isolate these rats in cages, and then they give them a choice between water, which has morphine or heroin, which is basically the same thing, and water that doesn't. And as soon as the rat tries the water with morphine in it, it just like can't get enough, and then it basically ODs and dies. And they have the video of this happening, and they speed it up, and then you see the dead rat, and it's like, well, there you go, that's heroin. And so Bruce was like, all right, let's actually put this to the test. And he did the rats in cages, and he did rats in something he called Rat Park. So he had like 40 rats in cages and 40 rats all from the same litter, and 40 rats living in community in this park where they had things to play with, and most importantly, they could have sex and get into little fights and
they had options.
Yeah, they had a social life. And then the rats in Rat Park just don't get addicted. Like, so and all the rats have the choice between regular water and water with morphine. And the water with morphine, in order to cover for the bitterness of the drug, actually has some sugar in it. So like, and the rats would still, like, they try with sugar, without sugar, all that stuff. And the rats in Rat Park would just like sometimes use the morphine, some of them more than others, whatever. But only like 1 out of 40 got addicted. And the rats in the cages, it's like 39 out of 40 or something. And so he was like, environment's playing a role here.
Yeah.
In whether or not people are in that addictive. So then he tries to get funding to do this on humans, and he tries a few different things, but it turns out it's really hard to get an ethics board to agree for you to like isolate humans for months or whatever.
And then feed them illicit substances. I can see how that might
exactly.
not,
so at some point he's like, fuck, I'm never going to be able to do this study. And he's like, okay, what's the closest thing I have to a lab? It's history. And so he just spends the next 35 years, I fucking kid you not, just like using all his free time, I don't know, all of it, a lot of his free time, to go into like libraries and read the greatest writers of all time, looking to references for anything that might look like addiction. And he finds it everywhere and in places you never expect. And he finds it in Plato, and he finds it in Aquinas, and he finds it, and then he starts to build a theory based on like what these guys were observing. And I think it's based primarily around something that he and I, through dialogue, started to call the Darwinian tension, which is, Darwin, we always talk about Origin of the Species as being Darwin's greatest work. And it was the one that had the most revolutionary impact. But he doesn't talk about humans in Origin of the Species. He only has one line. I mean, it's a hot topic because it was going to, like, the mostly religious world was going to like really have a backlash. So he says, this theory will undoubtedly have repercussions for our own species in the future. Something like this is like
Yeah.
the only line talking about
He's
humans.
vague posting. Yeah.
Totally. But then he spends the next like 11 years really focusing on humans. And he comes out with something called The Descent of Man, which I highly suggest people reading. It is a fully eugenicist reading of humans, right? Like he's basically advocating for eugenics. But like, other than that chapter, it's, I think, like really useful. And so one of the things he talks about is the main difference between us and other species in terms of evolution is that we have another evolutionary force, which is group evolution, which is happening in actually going against the survival of the fittest aspect. So the individual side, survival of the fittest side, is its psychological impact is, in order to get the best mate or to procreate or to get my genes into the future as far as possible, I want to be seen as the smartest, the strongest, the most beautiful, the fastest, whatever, like that in the community. I want to be seen as those things, right? But we also evolved in groups to a greater degree than any other species. And we rely on the group for our survival in a way that probably goes beyond almost any other species, with like some extent like ants and stuff that are harder to study. And so the result of that is that the groups that actually have a lot of characteristics that run counter to those out compete the groups that are a bunch of individuals looking out for themselves. So the groups in which everybody feels like they're a part of the group, they have a social solidarity, outperform the other groups if everything else is the same. Groups where there's higher trust amongst each other. So that has created a tension, a psychological tension in the way our brains have evolved, that we, on one hand, want to be seen as uniquely smart, beautiful, strong, fast, whatever, so that we stand out from the group. But we also have a deep psychological need to be seen as part of the group at the same time. And if you're looking for an evolutionary explanation for culture, it is that cultural spaces and cultural places and cultural activities are our opportunity to do both at the same time. So if you are in Cuba and you like see people dancing salsa in a room, you're like, oh, these are Cubans dancing salsa. They have this group activity that they do that makes them different from other groups, that gives them a group identity, and they all know how to do it. And if you watch closely, you'll see like, oh, that lady like does her spin like while looking to the left and like throws out her right elbow, and like this guy is like never making eye contact, and so he's showing off that he can do the moves without ever looking at his partner. Like you see how as individuals they are trying to stand out while doing
they have their own
activity.
flair, their own emphasis on it.
Right. And these cultures evolve often very quickly and often over long periods, right? And so where does addiction come from? Addiction comes from, according to Bruce, and I'm almost a full believer in this. I would need to test it a bit more, but like comes from something called dislocation, when you're missing one of those two things. So when you're not getting either the feeling of individuality or that ability to express your own freedom, your individuality, or you're missing that group solidarity, that feeling of being part of a group. And his reading is that like basically if you're looking at a story of why so a lot of cultures don't have words for addiction. They didn't see much of it. It's like and depression and some of these things that lead. So if you go into the biochemical thing, is like when you don't have those things, you start to get negative self-thoughts, and then whatever you find that successfully pushes out the negative self-thoughts, because your brain understands those negative self-thoughts to be a threat. Maybe you'll eat less, maybe you'll commit suicide, whatever. That whatever pushes those thoughts out is now what you're going to keep doing. So it might be a drug, it might be porno, it might be listening to podcasts.
Could be a whole bunch of things. Yeah,
exactly. It could be anything that successfully pushes out. I know by my own habits that like when I'm feeling low, when I'm like the few times I would say I was depressed, I get obsessed with like podcasts and stuff. I just flood my brain with knowledge so that I don't give myself an opportunity to think those negative thoughts. I just like flood. And so different people manifest in different ways. And my reading of like the last few hundred years is that we've had two ideologies that have been obsessed with resolving our material needs
Mm-hmm.
and they've been super successful in certain ways at transforming the world, and they've wiped out cultures. So both
Mm-hmm.
communism and capitalism, like one of them is so focused on elevating the individual and
Mm-hmm.
couldn't give a shit about the group,
Mm-hmm.
capitalism, and the other one is obsessed with the group and like needs to destroy the individual,
Mm-hmm.
communism. And the result is a bunch of dislocated people with negative self-thoughts.
Mm-hmm. So if we're putting this all together, like,
Yeah,
and we see, well, I'm just trying to reflect back to you what I'm
yeah, that was a
hearing,
lot.
right?
Yeah.
No, 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 it was a lot, but it was interesting.
uh,
So what I like about this is that it doesn't seem to fit neatly into any particular category. So I think it'll be provocative for listeners, and get their juices flowing, which is ultimately what I want for the show.
yeah.
So if we're gonna put this all together with sort of like um, nuclear and what we want for tomorrow, what we
Mm-hmm.
want for the future. Would I be correct in saying what I'm hearing from you is that we are deprived of certain cultural needs, and
Some of us, yeah.
some of us, yeah,
Yeah.
and those cultural needs absolutely won't be met if we don't solve some of the technical challenges ahead of us. What we need is a bridge to the future in which that can happen.
Mm-hmm.
And that is part of the nuclear narrative to you, right? Is that if we experience the scarcities and repercussions that you've talked about,
Mm-hmm.
in no way will that improve the lot of those who are suffering from dislocation. In fact, it might breed more and deeper dislocations.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, like I don't want to make it sound like dislocation is the worst thing that can happen to a human. Like I
No,
think
of
getting
course
killed
not.
is the worst thing that can happen to humans. So like for me, for me, it's
Yeah.
like you might not feel dislocated while you're at war because you've got this like clear mission and you're part of a
Mm-hmm.
troop and you've got your own role and like
Mm-hmm.
actually your
Right. So
Darwinian tension
so
is
we don't want to
resolved. It's
say
like,
we don't
yeah,
want to say like non-dislocation is a complete good in and
right,
of itself, right?
right, right,
So we don't
right.
want to say that either. I
Yeah,
don't
yeah,
think
yeah.
that's what you were saying.
No, no, no.
But
Yeah.
it's good that we have that
I
clarification.
guess for me, what it means in terms of my nuclear advocacy is like I'm not advocating that we just focus all our attention on solving our material needs
Mm-hmm.
through economic development, technological progress, all this stuff. Like we are a much more complex being than that. Like
Mm-hmm.
as humans, like our psychology is way more complicated than that, and that does not resolve. And like people will not respond to that necessarily in the way you might like map out.
Mm-hmm.
It's like if you try to go all game theory thinking about humans
Sure.
like that. um
Mm-hmm.
and so anyways, I think that like for me that what that whole diatribe, what it reinforces for me is just that let's not confuse resolving material needs with like human happiness. They're
Mm.
not
Yeah,
they're
yeah.
related, but they're not the same thing.
They're not identical. No, I think that's a
Yeah.
great point, and I think that that's one that when we confront these things like society-wide dislocation, like the anxiety and depression and resentment, I think that seem
Mm.
to be so pervasive. I think it would do us better, not just as advocates, but as people, to understand that there's no real one weird trick for this,
Yeah.
where you just build the right things and it all works out.
Right.
Right. And I love the emphasis that we are more than just happiness machines that are sated through technocratic management and consuming various goods.
Right.
So that to me is something that I think we should all hold in our heads. And I've been trying to think, and I just want to leave this here about what the full human picture means in terms of our energy advocacy. How do we see human society and what we need and how we can
Mm-hmm.
be and what's important? I think there'll be a lot of different answers that come out of that. But
Mm-hmm.
until we can come up with a good story about why, and a true story about why it's important that we achieve these material things, because they're about something bigger than that, will struggle to succeed in convincing people and bringing people on. So, Jesse, thank you for coming on and
Can I
blowing
just
my
throw
mind
one
with
thing about
that
that?
part.
Can I just throw
Yeah,
like one
please
quick
go
thing about
ahead.
that?
Yeah, yeah,
Like,
go
cause it
ahead.
just actually, as you were saying that, it actually came to me like, where do I see nuclear in this whole story? And I
Mhm.
think for me, it's all about getting to a global equality of opportunity,
Mm,
in large ways. Like the amount of human potential that's lost right now by not having everybody with access to healthcare, education,
mhm.
electricity, all this stuff like that. Like, and I don't mean that just in terms of further technological projects, but like art and
Yeah,
just
the
like
whole human
just
picture.
creation, the whole human thing, and solving our problems and creating beauty on earth. Like
Mhm.
I don't want to be part of an environmental movement or a ecological movement that is suffocating that by saying like, no, we can't make any more energy, or like we have to stop. Anyways,
I love that.
so I need to see everybody with access to electricity and enough of it to get to like a good level of decent living so that they can create and have free time and all that stuff. And I need everybody to have that. And nuclear is the only way I see that possible right now.
I love that. That's perfect. That's a great
Yeah.
place to end. That's a beautiful vision. I very much co-sign that. And everybody, I hope that things came up that are provocative in a helpful way. And I highly recommend you check out Jesse's work, which will again be in the show notes. And I'm sure we will find occasion to talk again. I would very much like that, whether we do it on record or not, Jesse.
Yeah,
Thanks for coming
equally. And
on.
yeah, if anybody has a critique they want to send me or put in the comments on Emmett's page or whatever, like I'm thinking out loud right now. Like I'm not
Totally.
preaching.
We're
I'm
in flux
literally,
here.
yeah, we're
Yeah,
in
we're in
flux
flux
and can
here.
be swayed. So
Yeah.
yeah, but you got
No,
to
I
bring
think
it. Like I don't sway easily.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
make sure you got footnotes.
Yeah, absolutely. So, everyone, bear that in mind. Stay sharp, stay strong, and stay radiant. We will see you next time.